Sometimes the lowest moment of your life becomes the doorway to something you never imagined possible. In 1887, a woman arrives at a remote Wyoming ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hunger that goes deeper than her empty stomach. She kneels at the gate and begs for work, any work at all. The mountain man who lives there is a solitary figure, used to silence and his own company. Instead of turning her away, he asks a simple question: "Will you take care of my horses?" It's just a job tending animals, a roof over her head, and warm meals. But sometimes, the smallest acts of mercy change everything. What happens when two lonely souls find purpose in each other's presence? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The gate stood like a sentinel between two worlds. On one side lay the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory, windswept and indifferent. On the other, a narrow dirt path wound upward through pine and aspen toward a collection of weathered buildings that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Sarah Hartwell's knees pressed into the cold earth as she gripped the rough wooden slats, her forehead resting against the sun-bleached wood. She had been kneeling there for nearly an hour. Her traveling dress, once a respectable dove grey, hung on her frame like a shroud. The fabric was torn at the hem, stained with mud and the dust of 1,000 miles. Her hands, once soft and suited to holding chalk and books, were blistered and calloused. The fingernails were broken, rimmed with dirt she no longer had the energy to clean. Her dark hair, streaked now with premature grey at 32, had come loose from its pins and hung in lank strands around a face hollowed by hunger and harder still by disappointment. 2 years. It had been 2 years since she had been Mrs. Sarah Hartwell, schoolteacher's wife, respected member of Philadelphia society. 2 years since Thomas had collapsed at his desk, his heart simply giving out at 41. 2 years since she discovered that his business partner had embezzled everything, leaving her with debts she could never repay and a reputation stained by association with fraud. The Philadelphia she had known closed its doors to her. The school board expressed their regrets. The ladies' auxiliary found reasons to be unavailable. Even her own sister, married to a banker, suggested it would be best if Sarah made herself scarce for a while. The shame, you understand. The talk. So she had gone west, chasing the vague promise of fresh starts and new beginnings that everyone spoke of, but few actually found. She had worked as a seamstress in Chicago until the factory closed, as a laundress in Omaha until the owner's advances became too insistent, as a hired girl in Cheyenne until the family's son cornered her in the pantry and his mother blamed her for the incident. Each job lost, each town left behind, took something from her. Pride first, then hope, then finally the belief that she deserved anything better than this, kneeling in the dirt, begging for work from a stranger. The sun had passed its zenith when she finally heard footsteps, heavy boots on hard ground, moving with the measured pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. Sarah kept her head down, unable to bear seeing rejection in another face. "You've been there a while." The voice was deep, roughened by disuse, with an accent that spoke of years in the mountains, not unkind, but not particularly welcoming either. Simply stating a fact. "Yes, sir." Sarah's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I'm looking for work. Any work. I can cook, clean, mend, whatever you need. I don't require much, just food and a place to sleep. Look at me." It was not a request. Sarah forced herself to lift her head, squinting against the afternoon sun. The man stood on the other side of the gate, and for a moment she thought he might be a bear that had learned to walk upright. He stood well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders and chest, with arms that strained the fabric of his worn flannel shirt. His face was weathered leather, lined deep around the eyes and mouth, framed by a thick beard shot through with grey. His hair, dark brown going to iron, hung past his collar. He might have been 40 or 50 or anywhere in between, but it was his eyes that held her. They were pale grey like winter sky, and they studied her with an intensity that made her want to look away. Not cruel, those eyes, but measuring, taking stock. You run from something or towards something? The question surprised her into honesty. Both. Neither. I don't know anymore. Something flickered across his face. Not quite a smile, but a softening. Name's James McKenna. Most call me Bear. Sarah Hartwell. You know horses, Sarah Hartwell? She paused, thinking of the carriage horses her father had kept when she was young, before he lost his money to bad investments. She had loved those horses, had spent hours in the stable when she should have been practicing piano. I'm good with animals. Bear studied her another long moment, then reached out and unlatched the gate. The hinges creaked as it swung open. Will you take care of my horses? Sarah stared at him, certain she had misheard. I'm sorry? I breed horses, working stock mostly, some riding horses for folks who appreciate quality. It's just me here, and I could use help with the animals. You do that, you get a cabin, meals, and a small wage. Nothing fancy. But it's honest work. She searched his face for the catch, the hidden condition, the price that would be too high to pay. But she found only that same measuring look, and perhaps something else, something that looked almost like loneliness. I'll take care of your horses, she said, and her voice didn't shake. Bear nodded once, as if a bargain had been struck, and gestured up the path. Come on, then. Daylight's wasting. Sarah rose on unsteady legs, her knees protesting after the long wait. She gathered her single carpet bag, everything she owned in the world, and followed him through the gate. As she passed through that threshold, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the absence of despair, which was its own kind of mercy. The ranch revealed itself gradually as they climbed. A main house, solidly built of logs and stone, smoke rising from its chimney. A large barn, its wood silvered with age but well maintained. Several corrals and paddocks, and beyond them pastures that stretched toward the tree line, and everywhere horses, bays and chestnuts, blacks and greys, some grazing peacefully, others watching the newcomers with intelligent eyes. How many? Sarah asked, momentarily forgetting her exhaustion. 42 head at the moment, 3 stallions, 20 mares, the rest are young stock and geldings. Bear's voice changed when he spoke of the horses, taking on a note of quiet pride. I breed for temperament and endurance. Flashy doesn't mean much up here. Need horses that can handle the mountains, the weather, the work. He led her past the main house to a smaller cabin, set back among the pines. It was simple, one room, by the looks of it, but the roof was sound, and the door hung straight on its hinges. This was meant for a hired hand I never got around to hiring, Bear said, pushing open the door. Stoveworks, beds there, privies out back. You'll take your meals at the main house. I eat at dawn and dusk. You miss it, you go hungry till the next one. Sarah stepped inside. The cabin was sparse but clean. A narrow bed with a straw mattress, a small table and chair, a wood stove, a shelf for belongings. A single window looked out toward the pastures. After sleeping in alleys and charity house basements, it seemed like a palace. It's perfect, she whispered. It's adequate, Bear corrected. I'll expect you at the barn an hour after dawn. I'll show you the horses, teach you the routine. You prove you can handle the work. We'll talk about making this permanent. Thank you. The words felt insufficient for what he was offering her. Thank you, Mr. McKenna. Bear, he said, already turning to leave. Just Bear. And don't thank me yet. You haven't seen how much work 42 horses make. He paused at the door, his broad frame filling it. There's bread and cheese on the table there, and a jug of water. Rest tonight. Tomorrow, the work begins. Then he was gone, his footsteps receding down the path. Sarah stood alone in her new home, the first real home she'd had in 2 years, and finally let herself sink onto the bed. The tears came then, hot and fierce and cleansing. But they weren't tears of despair anymore. They were something else entirely, something she was afraid to name, in case naming it made it disappear. Outside her window, a horse whinnied softly in the gathering dusk. Sarah closed her eyes and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Dawn came cold and clear to the mountains. Sarah woke to the unfamiliar sound of silence, no city noise, no other boarders coughing through thin walls, no landlady banging on doors, just the whisper of wind through pine trees and the distant call of a hawk. She dressed quickly in her oldest clothes, grateful she'd kept her late husband's work shirt for warmth. It hung loose on her frame, but it was sturdy. Her hands trembled slightly as she tied back her hair. Not from fear, but from something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Anticipation. Bear was already in the barn when she arrived, forking hay into mangers with the efficient movements of long practice. He glanced up at her approach, nodded once, and continued working. "You'll start with the morning feed," he said without preamble. "Hay first, then grain for those that get it. Each horse has different needs. I'll show you who gets what." For the next hour, Sarah followed him through the barn, learning names and temperaments. There was Granite, the oldest stallion, Grey as his name, and wise with years. Thunder, younger and more spirited, who pawed impatiently at his stall door. The mares, Juniper and Sage, Meadow and Willow, each with her own personality, her own way of greeting the morning. But it was the mare in the last stall that stopped Sarah in her tracks. She was a chestnut beauty, delicate-featured with a white blaze down her face, but she pressed herself into the far corner of the stall, trembling, her eyes rolled white-rimmed with fear. "That's Rosie," Bear said, his voice dropping lower. "Got her cheap from a rancher down valley. He'd beaten her near to death for being skittish. She's been here 3 months and still won't let me near her without a fight." Sarah's heart clenched. She knew something about being beaten down by circumstance, about learning to fear every hand that reached for you. Without thinking, she opened the stall door. "Careful," Bear started, but Sarah was already inside. She didn't approach the mare. Instead, she sat down in the clean straw, making herself small, unthreatening. She began to hum an old lullaby her mother had sung, back when the world was kinder. She didn't look at Rosie directly, just sat and hummed and waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Bear stood outside the stall, watching with an expression Sarah couldn't read. Finally, Rosie took one step forward, then another. Her nose stretched out, nostrils flaring as she tested Sarah's scent. Sarah remained still, kept humming. The mare took another step, and another, until her soft muzzle touched Sarah's shoulder. "Hello, sweetheart," Sarah whispered. I know what it's like to be afraid." She felt rather than saw Bear move away, giving them privacy. When she finally emerged from the stall 20 minutes later, Rosie was eating hay contentedly, no longer pressed against the wall. Bear was checking a gelding's hooves, but he looked up as she approached. "That's a gift," he said simply, "the way you have with her." "She just needed someone to understand," Sarah replied. Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition of shared wounds, shared understanding. Then Bear cleared his throat and returned to business. "Right, let's show you the rest." The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, feed and water, muck stalls, groom the horses, check hooves and legs for injury, turn out those who could be trusted in the pastures, exercise those who needed it. The work was endless and exhausting, but Sarah had never felt more alive. Her body, softened by years of genteel poverty, began to remember its strength. Her hands grew sure with the curry comb and hoof pick. The horses, sensing her genuine care, began to trust her. Even Thunder, who Bear said tolerated no one but him, started nickering when Sarah approached his stall. In the evenings, she and Bear ate together in the main house, simple meals of bread and stew, venison and potatoes. At first, they ate in silence, but gradually, conversation began to flow. Bear spoke little about his past, but Sarah learned he'd been a trapper in his younger years, had lived among the Shoshone, had only started the horse ranch 10 years ago. Needed something to come home to, he said one evening, staring into his coffee. Something that depended on me. Sarah understood. The horses gave purpose to the empty spaces grief created. 3 weeks into her stay, the weather changed. The wind shifted, bringing with it the scent of distant rain and the promise of storm. Bear spent the day securing the ranch, reinforcing the barn doors, moving the most valuable stock into protected paddocks. Big one coming, he said at dinner. Mountain storm, could last days. He wasn't wrong. The storm hit just after midnight. Sarah woke to the sound of thunder so loud it shook the cabin walls. Lightning split the sky, turning night to day in violent flashes. The wind howled like something alive and angry, and she could hear debris hitting the cabin's roof. She dressed quickly and was about to lie back down when she heard a horse screaming. Without thinking, Sarah grabbed her coat and ran out into the storm. The rain hit her like a fist, instantly soaking through her clothes. She couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, but she ran toward the barn, guided by instinct, and another scream from a terrified horse. The barn door had blown partially open, banging violently against its frame. Inside, most of the horses were restless but secure. But Rosie's stall was empty. The door somehow opened. And from the far end of the barn, Sarah heard labored breathing. She found the mare in one of the empty foaling stalls, down on her side, her belly distended. Sarah's heart sank. She'd known Rosie was pregnant. Bear had mentioned it, but the foal wasn't due for another month. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured, kneeling beside the panicked mare. "Easy now." She'd helped birth foals before, years ago on her father's small property. She'd been just a girl then, but her father had believed in teaching practical skills. The knowledge came back to her now, urgent and necessary. The storm raged outside. Lightning illuminated the barn in strobe-like flashes. Sarah worked by feel as much as sight, her hands sure even as her heart pounded. Rosie was in distress. The foal wasn't positioned right, and if Sarah didn't act quickly, both might die. She didn't know how long she worked. Time became meaningless in the chaos of storm and crisis. Her arms were slick to the elbows, her body shaking with effort. But finally, she felt the foal shift, felt it begin to move correctly. "That's it," she breathed. "Come on, Rosie, you can do this." One more contraction, and the foal slipped free into Sarah's waiting hands. A filly, perfect and tiny, gasping her first breaths. Sarah cleared the membrane from her face, rubbed her roughly with straw to stimulate breathing, and felt tears mix with the rain still dripping from her hair. "You're here," she whispered. "You made it." "Sarah?" She turned to find Bear standing in the barn doorway, lantern in hand, rain streaming from his oilskin coat. His eyes went wide as he took in the scene. Sarah covered in blood and birth fluids, the exhausted mare, the newborn filly already trying to stand on impossibly long legs. He crossed the space in 3 strides, dropping to his knees beside them. His big hands, surprisingly gentle, checked over the foal, then Rosie. When he looked up at Sarah, his expression held something she'd never seen there before. "You delivered her alone," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I couldn't let them die." Sarah's voice shook now that the crisis was past. "I heard Rosie, and I couldn't. You could have been killed. That door was hanging by one hinge. The roof." He stopped, seemed to struggle with words. "You could have been hurt. But I wasn't. And they're alive." Bear's jaw worked. Then, to Sarah's shock, he reached out and pulled her into an embrace. It was brief, almost awkward, but fierce. She could feel him trembling. "Don't do that again," he said roughly, pulling back. "Not without me." The storm continued for 3 more days, just as Bear had predicted. They were trapped together in the barn and house, caring for the animals, keeping the fires going, watching over Rosie and her filly. In those 3 days, something fundamental shifted between them. Bear told her about his wife Little Bird. Her name had been daughter of a Shoshone chief. They'd been married for 5 years when she died giving birth to their daughter. The baby had lived only 3 days. "I buried them together," he said, staring into the fire on the second night of the storm. "Up on the ridge where she liked to watch the sunset. That was 10 years ago. Haven't much wanted company since." "Why did you let me stay?" Sarah asked softly. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw past the weathered exterior to the lonely man beneath. "Because you looked the way I felt," he said. "Lost. Looking for a reason not to give up entirely." On the 3rd day, Sarah was checking on the horses when she noticed something glinting in the corner of Rosie's stall. She picked it up, a silver pocket watch, ornate and old. She opened it to find a photograph inside, a beautiful native woman holding an infant, both captured in a moment of perfect joy. Bear's voice came from behind her. "I didn't know I'd dropped that." Sarah turned, holding the watch carefully. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to pry." He took it from her, his thumb tracing the photograph. "Her name was Little Bird. Our daughter, we called her Morning Star. She had her mother's eyes. They were beautiful. They were everything." His voice cracked on the last word. "And then they were gone, and I didn't know how to be anything but alone." Sarah understood then why he lived the way he did, why he'd built walls of silence and solitude. She understood because she'd been building her own walls, brick by brick, loss by loss. "I'm sorry," she said, "for your loss, for your pain." Bear nodded, tucking the watch back into his pocket. "I'm sorry for yours too. Thomas, he was a good man." He was. Not perfect, but good. He tried his best. Sarah smiled sadly. "In the end, that's all we can ask. You loved him." "I did, and I grieved him. But I'm still here, and he would have wanted me to keep living." She paused. "Just as your wife and daughter would have wanted that for you." Something broke open in Bear's face, then something that had been locked tight for a decade. He didn't speak, but tears tracked through his beard, and Sarah understood that sometimes there were no words for the size of certain losses. She didn't say anything else. She simply stood beside him, 2 people who had known grief as the storm finally began to quiet outside. When the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, the world was washed clean and new. Bear and Sarah stood at the barn door, watching Rosie nuzzle her filly in the pasture, both healthy and strong. "Thank you," Bear said quietly, "for saving them. For—" He gestured vaguely, unable or unwilling to articulate the rest. But Sarah understood, for seeing his grief, for sharing hers, for being someone who could stand in the wreckage of the past and still tend to new life. "You're welcome," she said simply. Neither of them knew yet what was growing between them, but the foundation had been laid in storm and shared sorrow, in the quiet understanding of 2 souls who had survived their own individual disasters and found, against all odds, shelter in each other's company. Late summer brought a golden richness to the valley. The hay was cut and stored, the colts were growing strong, and the ranch's reputation continued to spread. Orders came from as far away as Montana and Colorado. People wanted McKenna horses, known now for their steady temperaments and mountain endurance. Sarah had been at the ranch for 5 months, and in that time she'd transformed from a desperate stranger into something essential. Bear couldn't imagine the ranch without her anymore, couldn't imagine his life without her. She was the first thing he thought of when he woke, and the last thing before sleep. The sound of her laughter had become his favorite music. The sight of her working with the horses, patient and skilled, filled him with a pride that had nothing to do with business success. They hadn't spoken of love yet, not in so many words. But it lived in every shared glance, every casual touch, every evening spent in quiet companionship. They were building toward something. Both of them knew it. But some things couldn't be rushed. Then the letter came. Sarah found it mixed in with the ranch correspondence when she picked up the mail in Prospect. The return address was Philadelphia, and her hands shook as she recognized her cousin Margaret's handwriting. She didn't open it immediately. Instead, she tucked it into her pocket and went about the day's work, feeling its weight like a stone against her hip. That evening, alone in her cabin, she finally broke the seal. The letter was brief and to the point. Margaret's husband, now principal of a prestigious girls' academy, was looking for a teacher. Margaret had convinced him that Sarah, despite her recent circumstances, was qualified. The position was Sarah's if she wanted it. Respectable employment, a return to society. Security. "You've suffered enough," Margaret wrote. "Come home. Come back to where you belong." Sarah read the letter 3 times, and each time she felt something different. Relief that her family hadn't entirely forgotten her, gratitude for the offer. But also, and this surprised her resistance, Philadelphia didn't feel like home anymore. The ranch did. These mountains, these horses, this life she'd built with her own hands, and Bear. Leaving would mean leaving him. She folded the letter and placed it in her journal, but she couldn't stop thinking about it. Over the next few days, she carried it everywhere, unable to decide what to do. Tell Bear, keep it to herself, accept the offer, refuse it. The decision terrified her because either choice meant giving up something important. Accept, and she'd have security but lose the life she loved. Refuse, and she'd be betting everything on a future that Bear had never explicitly promised. Bear noticed her distraction. "Something troubling you?" "No," Sarah lied, and felt guilty for it. "Just tired." But the distance between them grew. Sarah didn't mean for it to happen, but the unspoken secret created a barrier. Bear, sensing her withdrawal, assumed the worst, that she'd tired of ranch life, that she'd realized what everyone in town said was true. She deserved better than a rough mountain man. The situation came to a head when Thomas Garrett returned. He'd completed his review of Bear's breeding stock and was ready to make an offer. But he came with more than just business on his mind. They sat in Bear's main room, negotiating the sale of 3 young mares. It was a fair deal, profitable for Bear and reasonable for Garrett. But as they were finalizing the agreement, Garrett shifted topics. "I've been thinking about what we discussed earlier, McKenna, about expansion, partnership. I still think there's opportunity for us to work together." Bear's jaw tightened. "I work alone, always have. Except you don't anymore, do you?" Garrett's eyes flicked to where Sarah was visible through the window, working with Rosie in the paddock. "You've got capable help now. That changes things. Miss Hartwell's employment doesn't change my business plans, doesn't it?" Garrett leaned back, affecting casual interest. "I've heard she might not be staying long anyway. Word from back east is her family's trying to bring her home, teach at some fancy school." Bear's blood went cold. He looked at Sarah through the window, saw the way she moved with unconscious grace, and felt something crack inside his chest. Was it true? Was she planning to leave? "That's her business," he said roughly. "Of course, but when she goes, you'll be back where you started, alone, trying to manage more than one man can handle." Garrett pulled out a document. "My offer stands. Partnership. You provide the breeding expertise, I provide the capital and land for expansion. We'd both profit." "And what would you get beyond profits?" Bear asked, his voice dangerous. Garrett smiled. "I'm a businessman, McKenna. I see opportunities and I take them. Miss Hartwell is a remarkable woman, wasted on manual labor. When she returns to teaching, perhaps she'd appreciate a gentleman's attention. Someone who can offer her the refinements she's accustomed to." Bear stood so abruptly his chair scraped across the floor. I'm simply being realistic. You're trying to manipulate circumstances to suit yourself. Sarah makes her own choices. Neither of us owns her, and neither of us can guarantee what she'll do. But I'll tell you this. Bear leaned down, his voice low and fierce. If she chooses to leave, it'll be because that's what's best for her, not because you maneuvered her into it. Now get off my land. Garrett left, but the seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, Bear couldn't concentrate on anything. Sarah was quieter than usual during dinner, and the silence between them felt wrong. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, Bear spoke. "Are you leaving?" Sarah's head snapped up. "What?" Garrett said, "Your family wants you back east. Teaching position." His hands clenched on the table. "Is it true?" Sarah's face flushed. "How did he—" She stopped, shook her head. "Yes," my cousin wrote, "there's a position available." The confirmation hurt worse than Bear had expected. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what I wanted to do." "Didn't know?" Bear pushed back from the table, unable to sit still. "Sarah, if you want to go, just go. Don't drag it out. That's not fair. What's not fair is finding out from Thomas Garrett that you're planning to leave. What's not fair is realizing I've been building towards something while you've been keeping secrets." Sarah stood too, her own temper rising. "I kept nothing from you. I was trying to figure out what I wanted." "And have you?" "Figured it out. I was close. Until Garrett showed up and you started accusing me of betrayal." Her eyes flashed. "What exactly have you been building toward, Bear? You've never said. We kiss in meadows and hold hands and share meals, but you've never once said what you want from me, what I am to you." Bear opened his mouth, then closed it. She was right. He'd been too afraid of rejection, too convinced she'd eventually leave, to speak his feelings plainly. "I thought it was obvious," he said finally, weakly. "It's not. Nothing's obvious. I'm standing here trying to choose between two lives, and I don't even know if one of them is real or just something I'm imagining." They stared at each other across the kitchen, both hurt and both too proud to bridge the gap. Finally, Sarah turned away. "I need to think." Alone, she left, and Bear let her go. He sank back into his chair, feeling older than his years. Garrett had been right about one thing. Sarah deserved better than this, better than a man who couldn't speak his heart plainly. But the thought of losing her was unbearable. The ranch would survive. He'd managed alone before. But he didn't want to just survive anymore. He wanted to live. And Sarah had taught him the difference. In her cabin, Sarah sat on the bed, with both letters in her hands. The one from Philadelphia, and the one she'd started writing to Margaret but never finished. The one that said, "I'm staying." She'd made her decision days ago, really. She was staying. The ranch, the horses, the mountains. Bear, this was where she belonged. But Bear's reaction tonight had shaken her. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe he saw her as temporary all along, helpful but ultimately dispensable. She pulled out the Shoshone necklace that Bear had given her weeks ago, the one that had belonged to his late wife. She'd worn it every day since, tucked beneath her shirt where no one could see. A promise, she'd thought. A sign that he saw a future with her. But maybe she'd been reading meanings that weren't there. Maybe Bear gave away pieces of his past to everyone. Maybe she was just another hired hand who happened to be useful with horses. Sarah pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, willing herself not to cry. She'd survived worse than heartbreak. She'd survived this too. But oh, how it hurt. How it hurt to realize she'd fallen completely in love with a man who might never love her back the same way. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines. Somewhere in the dark, a horse whinnied softly. The sounds that had become home to her. The sounds she couldn't imagine living without. But maybe imagination wasn't enough. Maybe it was time to face reality and make the safe choice, even if it meant leaving her heart behind in the Wyoming mountains. 3 days passed in painful awkwardness. Sarah and Bear worked together because the horses still needed care, but the easy companionship was gone. They spoke only when necessary, kept their distance, and both looked miserable. The horses sensed the tension. Even Thunder, usually calm under Bear's hand, became skittish and difficult. Rosie refused to leave her stall one morning, standing protectively over Storm as if sensing danger. It was the mare's distress that finally forced Sarah and Bear to work together properly. Rosie had developed a slight limp, favoring her front left leg. Sarah noticed it first, but she needed Bear's strength to examine the hoof properly. "Hold her steady," Sarah said quietly, running her hand down Rosie's leg. Bear murmured to the mare, his big hands gentle despite the tension in his shoulders. Sarah worked carefully, checking for stones or infection. The mare trembled but allowed the examination. "There," Sarah said finally, finding a small abscess forming. "We need to poultice this. If it gets worse, she could be permanently lamed." They worked together through the afternoon and into the evening, taking turns keeping the warm compress on Rosie's hoof, monitoring her temperature, ensuring she stayed calm. The crisis demanded their full attention, leaving no room for wounded pride or hurt feelings. As night fell, Sarah prepared another poultice, while Bear held Rosie's head, speaking soft words in Shoshone. Sarah caught fragments of what he was saying, words she'd picked up over the months, and realized he was telling the mare about the storm, about the night Storm was born, about Sarah's courage and skill. "You're healing," Sarah said quietly. "Your Shoshone is improving." Bear looked at her over Rosie's back, and in the lantern light, his eyes were full of regret. "Not the only thing that needs healing." Sarah's hands stilled on the bandage. "No, it's not." They continued working in silence, but something had shifted. The wall between them had developed cracks. When Rosie was finally settled and comfortable, both of them exhausted, they stood outside the stall. The night was clear, stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt. "Sarah," Bear started. "Let me speak first." Sarah took a breath, gathering courage. "I've made my decision. About Philadelphia." Bear braced himself, his jaw tight. "I'm not going. I tore up the letter 3 days ago. Before Garrett came, before we argued, I'd already decided to stay." Bear's eyes widened. "You had?" "Yes, because this is where I belong, with the horses in these mountains. With," she faltered, then pushed forward, "with you, if you'll have me." Bear reached for her, then stopped himself. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I should have said it weeks ago, months ago maybe. I was just—" He shook his head. "I was terrified." "Of what?" "Of this. Of caring for someone again, of building a life with someone and then losing them." His voice dropped. "I lost everything once, my wife, my daughter. It nearly destroyed me. Coming back from that kind of pain, I didn't think I could survive it twice. So you kept me at arm's length." "I tried to, but Sarah, you got past every defense I had. You walked into my life and reminded me what it felt like to want something more than just surviving another day." He moved closer, his hands reaching for hers. "I love you. I've loved you since the night you delivered Storm, in the middle of that storm, risking yourself for a frightened mare, maybe even before that." Sarah's breath caught. "Bear, I'm not good with words. I'm rough and uneducated, and I live hard. But I love you more than I've ever loved anyone, including—" He stopped, struggled. "Including her. Little bird. She was my first love, and I'll always carry her memory. But you're my second chance, and I'll be damned if I lose you, because I was too afraid to speak plainly." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out the beaded Shoshone necklace. "I gave this to you before, but you probably didn't understand what it meant. In Little Bird's culture, when a man gives a woman his first wife's jewelry, it's a promise that he honors the past but chooses the future, that he's ready to love again." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "I've been wearing it every day." I know. I've seen it under your collar. He smiled sadly. I hoped you understood, but I should have said the words, so I'm saying them now. I love you, Sarah Hartwell. I want you to stay, not as my hired hand, but as my wife, as my partner in everything. Bear. I know it's not much, a mountain ranch, a rough life, a man who's better with horses than words, but it's yours if you want it. I'm yours if you'll have me. Sarah laughed through her tears, joy bubbling up like spring water. You foolish man. I decided to stay before you said any of this. I chose you. I chose this life, not because of promises or proposals, but because this is where my heart is. She reached up, cupping his bearded face in her hands. But since you're asking, yes, yes to all of it, yes to being your wife and your partner, yes to this life we're building, yes to loving you with everything I am. Bear pulled her close, and they kissed with all the pent-up longing of the past few days, the past few months, perhaps the past few years of loneliness. When they finally pulled apart, both were shaking. We've wasted so much time, Bear said against her hair. Being afraid, holding back, not wasted. Learning. Sarah smiled up at him, learning to trust again, learning that love is worth the risk. They stood there in the barn, surrounded by the soft sounds of horses settling for the night, and let themselves be happy. Two broken people who'd found each other, who'd chosen courage over fear, who'd decided that love was worth whatever pain might come. When? Bear asked. When will you marry me? Tomorrow, if you like, or next month. I don't care about ceremonies or fuss, I just want to be with you. Tomorrow's too soon. Need to do it right. Need a proper wedding, even if it's small. He grinned. Besides, Running Elk would never forgive me if he missed it. Sarah laughed. Then we'll wait for Running Elk. But Bear, I'm not going anywhere. Not ever. Promise? I promise. They walked back to the main house together, hand in hand, talking of weddings and futures and the life they would build together. The horses watched them go, Rosie and Storm standing peacefully in their stall, the mare's injury already beginning to heal. Sometimes healing took time. Sometimes trust had to be rebuilt carefully, like a poultice applied with patience. But when two people were willing to do the work, to speak the hard truths and face their fears together, anything was possible. Even second chances, even love born from desperation and mercy at a mountain gate. Autumn arrived with a painter's palette of gold and crimson. The aspens turned brilliant yellow, shimmering in the mountain wind. The air grew crisp, carrying the promise of winter. Sarah and Bear moved through their days with new lightness, planning a simple wedding for early October when Running Elk could make the journey from his winter camp. Sarah had written to Margaret, declining the teaching position with gratitude and explaining her engagement. She expected judgment or disappointment, but she'd made peace with whatever response might come. She'd chosen her path, and for the first time in years, she felt certain it was the right one. Then a stranger arrived at the ranch on a grey afternoon when the first snow was dusting the peaks. He was a slight man in a city suit, carrying a leather satchel and riding a horse that clearly wasn't accustomed to mountain trails. Bear and Sarah were working with the yearlings when he approached, picking his way carefully across the muddy yard. "Mr. McKenna? Miss Hartwell?" His voice was educated, Eastern. "My name is Edmund Carstairs. I'm an attorney from Denver. I've been looking for Miss Hartwell for quite some time." Sarah's stomach dropped. Had someone filed a claim against her late husband's estate? Was she being sued for debts she couldn't pay? All her old fears came rushing back. "Looking for me? Why?" Carstairs dismounted carefully, brushing dust from his coat. "Could we speak somewhere private? This is a matter of some delicacy and considerable importance." They led him to the main house, Bear standing protectively close to Sarah. Carstairs settled at the kitchen table, opening his satchel to withdraw several official-looking documents. "Miss Hartwell, I represent the estate of one Marcus Hartwell. I believe he was your late husband's uncle? Sarah searched her memory. I met him once, years ago, at our wedding. He sent Thomas a letter occasionally, but they weren't close. No, they weren't. Marcus was something of a black sheep, left Philadelphia for the Colorado mining country 40 years ago and never looked back. Your husband, I gather, thought him rather disreputable. Carstairs smiled slightly. Marcus would have taken that as a compliment. What does this have to do with Sarah? Bear asked, his hand finding hers under the table. Marcus Hartwell passed away 6 months ago. He left a considerable estate, and finding his heirs has proven challenging. Your husband, Miss Hartwell, was his only nephew. When I couldn't locate you in Philadelphia, I had to trace your movements west. It's taken over a year. Sarah's head spun. I don't understand. What estate? Marcus lived in a mining camp. He did, but he also owned a silver mine, the Silver Bell mine, outside of Silverton, Colorado. Carstairs pulled out another document, and 3 months ago that mine struck an exceptionally rich vein. The ore is testing at premium grade. I still don't. Miss Hartwell, your late husband inherited half ownership of that mine. The other half went to Marcus's business partner. When your husband died, that half passed to you. You, Miss Hartwell, are now half owner of one of the most productive silver mines in Colorado. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah stared at the lawyer, unable to process the words. Bear's hand tightened on hers. How much? Bear's voice was rough. Carstairs met his eyes. Current estimates place the mine's value at approximately $200,000, with projected annual profits of $30,000 to $40,000. Miss Hartwell's share would be half that. Sarah's vision swam. $100,000. She'd been living on pennies, begging for work, believing herself destitute, and all along she'd been, "That can't be right," she whispered. Thomas's business partner embezzled everything. We lost everything. He embezzled from the Philadelphia shipping business, yes, but Marcus's mine was purchased years earlier, before your husband even married. The investment was separate, held in trust, and thus protected from creditors and fraud. It was simply overlooked in the chaos following your husband's death. Carstairs slid papers across the table. I need your signature on several documents to formalize the transfer. The mine is operating profitably under current management. You need do nothing but collect quarterly dividends, or you could sell your share. I have 3 separate offers already. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't think. Suddenly, impossibly, she was wealthy. She could go anywhere, do anything. She could return to Philadelphia in triumph, buy a house, live independently with comfort and security. All the things she'd lost, she could have back. I need time to think, she managed. Of course. I'm staying at the hotel in Prospect for the next 3 days. You can find me there when you're ready. Carstairs stood, leaving the papers on the table. Congratulations, Miss Hartwell. Your circumstances have changed considerably. After he left, Sarah and Bear sat in stunned silence. The papers lay between them like a wall. $100,000, Bear finally said. His voice was hollow. You're rich. I don't feel rich. I feel... Sarah pressed her hands to her face. I feel like I'm dreaming. You could go anywhere now, do anything. Bear stood abruptly, moving to the window. Philadelphia, Europe, you could have that fancy life Garrett talked about. Bear, I'm happy for you, truly. You deserve this after everything you've been through. But his shoulders were rigid, his voice carefully controlled. You deserve better than a mountain ranch and a rough man who can barely write his own name. Sarah stood, anger cutting through her shock. Don't you dare use this as an excuse to push me away. I'm not pushing. I'm being realistic. He turned to face her, and the pain in his eyes broke her heart. Sarah, 3 months ago you were desperate. You took this job because you had no choice. Now you have every choice in the world. I chose you before I knew about the money. Did you? Or did you just convince yourself this was your only option?" He gestured at the papers. "Now you have other options. Better options." "There are no better options." Sarah crossed to him, grabbing his arms. "I love you. That hasn't changed because some lawyer showed up with papers. Everything's changed. You just don't see it yet." Bear gently freed himself from her grip. "Think about it, Sarah. Really think. You could teach at the finest schools, live in comfort, never worry about money again. You could have everything you lost, and more. I don't want what I lost. I want what I have. For now. But what about in 5 years? 10? When you're stuck on a mountain ranch, working until your hands are rough and your back aches, while your friends from Philadelphia are living elegant lives." His voice dropped. "When you resent me for holding you back from what you could have been, that would never happen. You don't know that. I don't know that." Bear moved toward the door. "Just think about it. Take the time Carstairs offered. Consider your options. Don't make a decision out of guilt or obligation." "I'm not." But he was already leaving, the door closing softly behind him. Sarah stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by legal documents that had just upended her entire world. The news spread through Prospect faster than wildfire. By the next morning, everyone knew that the desperate woman who'd begged for work was now an heiress. The transformation in how people treated her was immediate and nauseating. Mrs. Kemper, who'd called her a scandal, now invited her to tea. The church ladies who'd tried to rescue her from impropriety now sought her company. And Thomas Garrett appeared at the ranch that same afternoon, all charm and calculation. "Sarah," he said, as if they were old friends, "I heard the remarkable news. You must be overwhelmed." "That's one word for it," Sarah continued, grooming thunder, not stopping her work. "I wanted to offer my assistance. Managing such wealth can be complicated, especially for someone," he caught himself, "for someone without experience in such matters. I have connections in Denver, financial advisors who could help you make the most of your good fortune." "How thoughtful." "And perhaps," Garrett moved closer, "perhaps you might reconsider my earlier offer, not as a hired woman, of course, but as a proper wife to a man who could match your new station. We could merge our holdings, build something truly impressive." Sarah set down the curry comb and faced him fully. "Mr. Garrett, let me be very clear. My circumstances have changed, but my feelings haven't. I'm engaged to Bear McKenna. That hasn't changed and won't change. But surely you see that changes things. McKenna is a good man, but he's," Garrett gestured vaguely, "he's limited. What can he offer you now that you can have anything? He can offer me love, respect, a partnership based on who I am, not what I'm worth." Sarah's voice was steel. "Something you've never offered and never will." Garrett's face hardened. "You're making a mistake. McKenna's land claim isn't even secure. There are boundary disputes, questions about the original homestead filing. If someone were to challenge it in court, he could lose everything." "Is that a threat?" "It's information, the kind of information a friend might share." His smile was cold. "Think carefully about where your loyalties lie, Sarah, and about what happens to McKenna if you tie your fortune to a man whose own holdings are built on sand." He left, and Sarah stood shaking with anger. But beneath the anger was fear. Could Garrett really challenge Bear's land? And what would Bear do if she used her new money to secure it? Would he see it as help or charity? Would it drive them further apart? That evening she found Bear in the barn, working late. He looked exhausted, and she knew he'd been avoiding her all day. "We need to talk," she said. "I know." He set down the bridle he was mending. "Sarah, I've been thinking, so have I, and I've made some decisions." She pulled out the papers Carstairs had left. "I'm going to accept the inheritance, sign all the papers, make it official. Something died in Bear's eyes. I understand. No, you don't. Let me finish. Sarah took a breath. I'm accepting the money because it's mine, and because refusing it would be foolish. But I'm not leaving. I'm not changing my plans. I'm marrying you, just as we arranged. Sarah, and I'm using half the mine's income to secure your land claim, to expand the ranch, hire proper help, and build the operation into something that can support multiple families. She held up a hand when he tried to interrupt. Not as charity, as investment, as partnership. The papers will show I own half the ranch, equal partners in everything. I can't let you. You can't stop me. This is my choice, my money, my decision about how to use it. She moved closer. Bear, I know you're afraid I'll regret this, that I'll wake up one day and resent you for the life I gave up. But the only life I'd regret is one without you. Bear's throat worked. The town will say I married you for your money. Let them say it. We'll know the truth. She pulled out one more document. And I have proof. This is a deed transfer, prepared by Carstairs at my request. It signs half the ranch to you. No conditions. Effective immediately. Even if I never sign the mine papers, this becomes yours. Not because of marriage, but because of what we've built together. You'd give me half the ranch? I'd give you all of it if you'd accept it. This place is as much yours as mine. More, really. You built it. I just helped it grow. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Don't you see? The money doesn't change who I am or what I want. It just means we can build our life without fear, without worrying about one bad winter or one sick horse destroying everything. Bear stared at the papers, then at her, and she saw the moment his fear finally cracked. You really mean it? You're staying. I'm staying. For the money, despite the money, whatever you want to call it, I'm staying because I love you, because this is home, because I'd rather be your partner on this mountain than a wealthy widow anywhere else. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. I'm sorry. I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I let fear make me stupid. We're both allowed to be afraid. As long as we're afraid together. Sarah pulled back to look at him. Equal partners? Equal partners. Bear kissed her, and it felt like sealing a vow. In everything. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall, covering the ranch in white. Inside the barn, two people held each other and let themselves believe in impossible things. In second chances and unexpected fortune. In love that survived both poverty and wealth. In partnerships built on something stronger than circumstance. They had no idea that the hardest test was still to come. The week after Sarah's decision was a whirlwind of activity and emotion. She met with Carstairs, signed the necessary papers, and formally accepted her inheritance. The lawyer seemed both pleased and puzzled by her insistence on the ranch partnership arrangement, but he drew up the documents according to her wishes. Most unusual, he remarked. In my experience, sudden wealth tends to drive people apart, not together. But you two seem determined to do things differently. We are, Sarah said firmly, Bear's hand warm in hers. Word of the official partnership spread through Prospect, generating exactly the gossip they'd expected. Half the town whispered that Bear had manipulated a vulnerable woman. The other half suggested Sarah had lost her mind, throwing away her fortune on a mountain hermit. Neither of them cared. They had each other, they had their plans, and they had Running Elk arriving in 2 weeks for the wedding. But Thomas Garrett wasn't finished. 3 days after Sarah signed the mine papers, the sheriff arrived at the ranch with unwelcome news. Garrett had filed a formal challenge to Bear's land claim, citing irregularities in the original homestead documentation from 15 years prior. I'm sorry, McKenna, Sheriff Dawson said, shifting uncomfortably. He's got lawyers from Denver. Says your boundaries overlap with territory he purchased from the railroad. Says you've been squatting on land that's rightfully his. That's a lie. Bear's voice was dangerously quiet. I filed proper claim, worked this land for 15 years, made all the improvements, paid every fee. This is legal. Maybe so. But Garrett's got paperwork that says otherwise. You'll need to appear before the territorial judge when he circuits through next month. Bring whatever proof you have. After the sheriff left, Bear stood in the yard, staring at the mountains. Sarah watched his shoulders hunch, saw him age 10 years in 10 seconds. He's doing this because of me, she said quietly. Because I refused him and chose you. He's doing it because he's a greedy bastard who wants this land and saw an opportunity. Bear turned to her, his face grim. But you're right that you're the trigger. If you hadn't come here, if we weren't together, don't you dare finish that sentence. Sarah crossed to him, fierce. This isn't my fault, and it isn't punishment for choosing each other. This is one cruel man trying to take what isn't his. The original homestead papers, Bear's voice cracked. Little Bird helped me file them. Her English was better than mine. If there's mistakes in the filing, then we'll fix them. We'll hire the best lawyers. We'll fight this. With your money. With our money. Our ranch. Our fight. Our resources. Sarah gripped his hands. That's what partnership means, Bear. We fight together. But the stress took its toll. Bear threw himself into work with punishing intensity, as if he could somehow keep the land through sheer force of will and labor. Sarah spent hours digging through his old papers, trying to understand the homestead claim and identify potential weaknesses in Garrett's challenge. They found the original documents in a battered tin box Bear kept under his bed. The papers were yellowed and water-stained, the handwriting Little Bird's neat script still legible, but the official stamps faded. Sarah's heart sank as she reviewed them. There were errors, small ones, a misdated signature, a boundary description that used landmarks instead of proper surveyor's marks. Nothing that should invalidate the claim, but enough to give a determined lawyer ammunition. This isn't as bad as it looks, she told Bear, though her confidence was shaking. The core claim is solid. You've made improvements, paid taxes, maintained continuous occupation. That counts for more than paperwork errors. Does it? Against Garrett's money and Denver lawyers. Bear slumped in his chair. Maybe I should just sell to him, take whatever he offers and move on. No. Sarah's voice was steel. No. You built this place. This is your home, your life's work. We don't surrender to bullies. She wrote to Carstairs, explaining the situation. He responded within days, recommending a lawyer in Cheyenne who specialized in land disputes. Marcus Brennan had a reputation for being both brilliant and ruthless, perfect for opposing Garrett's challenge. Brennan arrived at the ranch a week later. He was a compact man in his 50s, with sharp eyes and an air of competent authority. He spent 2 days reviewing every document, walking the property boundaries, and interviewing both Bear and Sarah about the ranch's history. It's winnable, he said finally, spreading papers across the kitchen table. Garrett's case relies on a technicality, a survey error from 1872 that placed a railroad land grant line 50 feet east of where it actually was. If that original survey stands, a corner of your property technically overlaps with land Garrett purchased. So he's right. Bear's face was grey. He's technically correct, but law isn't just about technicalities. You've occupied and improved this land for 15 years. You filed in good faith, based on the best information available. You've paid taxes and met all homestead requirements. The Homestead Act and territorial law both favor settlers who've made legitimate improvements over speculators purchasing at discount from railroads. But will the judge see it that way? Brennan's smile was thin. Judges in this territory are generally sympathetic to working ranchers over wealthy land speculators, especially when the speculator in question has a reputation for sharp dealing. But I'll be honest, it could go either way. We need to present an overwhelming case that you're the rightful owner not just legally, but morally. Over the following weeks, they prepared for the hearing. Brennan was thorough and demanding, requiring documentation of every improvement Bear had made, the barn he'd built, the corrals, the irrigation he'd dug by hand, the cabin where Sarah now lived. He interviewed neighbors who could testify to Bear's continuous occupation and good character. Sarah coordinated everything, using her newly available funds to pay for surveys, documentation, and witness expenses. But the strain showed on both of them. Bear grew quiet and withdrawn, barely eating. Sarah threw herself into preparation with manic energy, terrified that if she stopped working for even a moment, everything would collapse. Their wedding plans hung in limbo. Running Elk arrived as promised, taking one look at the situation and setting up camp near the ranch to offer support. His presence steadied them both, a reminder that some things mattered more than land and legal battles. "You forget what's important," Running Elk told them one evening as they sat around his fire. "Land is just dirt. What matters is the life you build on it, the love you share. Those things no court can take away." "But if we lose the ranch," Sarah started. "Then you build somewhere else, together." The old trapper smiled. "You think I worry about land? I've lived my whole life moving with the seasons. Home isn't a place, it's people who matter." Bear stared into the fire. "This place, it's where I buried my wife and daughter. It's where I rebuilt my life after losing them. It's where Sarah found me. I can't just—" His voice broke. "I can't lose it." "Then you fight," Running Elk said simply. "But you fight, knowing that the land doesn't define you, you define yourself." 3 days before the hearing, Sarah discovered something in Garrett's filed documentation. She was reviewing copies of his land purchase records when she noticed an inconsistency. The railroad grant he'd purchased included a section that had supposedly been surveyed in 1872, but the survey company listed in the document hadn't been chartered until 1874. "It's a forgery," she breathed, showing the papers to Brennan, "or at least a fabrication. The survey he's basing his claim on couldn't have been conducted when he says it was." Brennan's eyes lit up. "This is it. This is what we need. If we can prove the survey was backdated or fabricated, his entire case collapses." He looked at Sarah with new respect. "You have a sharp eye, Miss Hartwell." "Actually," Bear said quietly, "it's going to be Mrs. McKenna, assuming I still have a ranch to offer her." "You do," Sarah said firmly, "and even if you didn't, the offer stands. I'm marrying you, Bear McKenna, for better or worse. Starting now, if Running Elk's willing." Bear's head snapped up. "Now? Why not? We've waited long enough. We've let fear and circumstances dictate everything. I'm done waiting." She turned to Running Elk. "Will you marry us tonight? Before the hearing? So no matter what happens, we face it as husband and wife?" Running Elk smiled slowly. "I've been wondering when you'd ask." They married that night under the stars, with Running Elk officiating in a blend of Christian and Shoshone traditions. Sarah wore a simple dress and the Shoshone necklace. Bear wore his best shirt and a look of wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. Brennan and his assistant served as witnesses, along with 2 neighboring ranchers who'd come to support Bear's case. The ceremony was simple and profound. They spoke vows about partnership and choosing each other through all circumstances. Running Elk blessed them in Shoshone, calling on the spirits of the mountains to watch over their union. And when Bear kissed his wife for the first time as a married couple, Sarah felt complete in a way she'd never imagined possible. "No matter what happens tomorrow," Bear whispered against her hair, "I'm the luckiest man alive." "Not luck," Sarah corrected. "Choice." That night, Sarah moved her things from the small cabin to the main house. It wasn't a grand wedding night. They were both too exhausted and anxious about the hearing. But they fell asleep in each other's arms, in the bed that was now theirs together, and for a few hours at least, the uncertainty of tomorrow couldn't touch them. The hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock in the morning. They arrived at the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne early, Brennan carrying 2 cases full of documentation. Garrett was already there with his Denver lawyers, looking confident and smug. The judge, a weathered man named Harlan Reed, took his seat and surveyed both parties with shrewd eyes. This is a land dispute between Thomas Garrett and James McKenna regarding approximately 80 acres in the Prospect Valley area. Mr. Brennan, you're representing McKenna. I am, Your Honor. And I should note that my client was married last night to Miss Sarah Hartwell, now Mrs. McKenna. She's here in support of her husband. Garrett's face tightened as he noticed Sarah sitting beside Bear, their hands clasped together. His lawyers whispered urgently. Judge Reed nodded. Very well. Mr. Garrett, you filed this challenge. Present your case. The hearing began, and with it, the fight for everything Bear had built, everything they'd built together, everything they hoped to build in the future. Sarah squeezed Bear's hand, and he squeezed back. Whatever came next, they would face it together, married, partnered, and unbreakable. That was worth more than any piece of land. But God willing, they'd keep the land too. This court, Judge Reed began, his voice carrying through the hushed room, was established to administer justice. Not just legal technicalities, but actual justice. The kind that honors the spirit of our laws, not just their letter. He looked at Garrett's lawyers. The survey document you've presented as the foundation of your client's claim is demonstrably flawed. It references a company that didn't exist at the stated date. That alone raises serious questions about the legitimacy of Mr. Garrett's purchase. Garrett started to stand, but his lawyer pulled him back down. Furthermore, Reed continued, even if we set aside the survey issue, this court must consider the purpose and intent of the Homestead Act. That act was designed to encourage settlement, improvement, and productive use of territorial lands. Mr. McKenna has done exactly that. For 15 years he has occupied, improved, and maintained the disputed property. He has paid all required taxes and fees. He has contributed to this territory's development. The judge turned to Bear. Mr. McKenna, your original filing did contain errors. In the future, I'd suggest consulting with an attorney for such matters. However, these were honest mistakes made in good faith, and they do not invalidate your fundamental claim. You have met every substantive requirement of the Homestead Act. Sarah gripped Bear's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Mr. Garrett, Reed said, his tone cooling, you purchased land from the railroad at discounted rates, which is your right, but you cannot use questionable surveys to expand that purchase into territory that has been lawfully occupied and improved by another man. This court will not reward speculation and legal maneuvering over genuine settlement and hard work. The gavel came down with a sharp crack. I rule in favor of the defendant, James McKenna. His homestead claim is valid and will remain valid. The boundary lines will be established according to his original filing, corrected for any survey errors. Mr. Garrett's claim to the disputed acreage is denied. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Then the meaning of the words hit her, and she turned to Bear, tears flowing freely. He looked stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what he'd heard. We won, she whispered. Bear, we won. His arms came around her, lifting her off her feet in a fierce embrace. Around them, the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Brennan was shaking hands with his assistant, grinning. Running Elk, who'd been sitting quietly in the back, nodded with satisfaction. Garrett stood abruptly, his face mottled with fury. He pushed past his lawyers and approached Bear and Sarah. This isn't over, McKenna. I'll appeal. Mr. Garrett. Judge Reed's voice cut through. I'd advise against making threats in my courtroom, and I'd further advise you to consider carefully before filing appeals based on the same flawed documentation. This court does not look kindly on frivolous or malicious litigation. Garrett's mouth worked, but no words came out. Finally, he spun on his heel and stalked from the courtroom, his lawyers scrambling to follow. Judge Reed approached Bear and Sarah. "Mr. McKenna, Mrs. McKenna, congratulations on your marriage and on your victory. I hope you have many good years on that land you've worked so hard to keep." "Thank you, Your Honor." Bear's voice was thick with emotion. "Thank you for seeing the truth. The law is supposed to protect honest folk doing honest work. Glad I could uphold that today." Reed smiled. "Now go home to your ranch. I believe you have horses that need tending." Outside the courthouse, the autumn sun was bright and warm. Sarah and Bear stood on the steps, breathing in the sweet air of victory and relief. Running Elk joined them, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "The spirits favor those with true hearts," he said. "They were with you today." Brennan emerged with his paperwork. "I'll file all the necessary documents to make the ruling official. Within a week, you'll have clear, undisputed title to your land. And Mrs. McKenna," he nodded to Sarah, "your discovery of that survey discrepancy was brilliant. You may have missed your calling as a legal investigator." Sarah laughed, giddy with relief. "I'll stick with horses, thank you, but I appreciate the compliment." They celebrated that night at a modest hotel in Cheyenne, the four of them, Bear, Sarah, Running Elk, and Brennan, sharing a meal and toasting their victory. But both Bear and Sarah were eager to return home, to see their ranch with new eyes, now that they knew it was truly, legally, unquestionably theirs. The next morning, they began the journey back to Prospect Valley. As they crested the final ridge and saw the ranch spread out below them, the barn, the corrals, the pastures with horses grazing peacefully, Bear pulled the wagon to a stop. "Look at it," he said softly. "Really look at it." Sarah did. She saw the place where she'd knelt at the gate months ago, desperate and hopeless. She saw the barn where she'd delivered Storm during the storm. She saw the cabin where she'd first found shelter. She saw the life they'd built together, acre by acre, day by day. "Home," she whispered. "Home," Bear agreed. "Ours. Forever." They rode down to the ranch, husband and wife, equal partners, ready to build the future they'd fought so hard to secure. 6 months later, spring returned to the mountains with its annual promise of renewal. The snow retreated, the meadows bloomed, and the ranch thrived in ways Bear had never imagined during his solitary years. The Hartwell McKenna Ranch, the new sign, hung over the gate. Carved by Bear and painted by Sarah, had expanded exactly as they'd planned. They'd hired 2 hands to help with the growing herd, young men from town who were grateful for honest work and fair treatment. The breeding program Sarah had developed was producing horses that were in demand across 3 territories. But more than business success, the ranch had become something neither of them had dared hope for, a real home filled with life and laughter. Sarah stood at the paddock fence, watching Bear work with a young colt. Her hand rested on the small swell of her belly, barely visible yet, but unmistakable to her. She hadn't told him yet. She wanted to wait for the right moment, to find the perfect words for news that felt miraculous after everything they'd survived. Bear glanced up and caught her watching. His face broke into the smile he saved just for her, the one that transformed his weathered features and made her heart skip even now, after months of marriage. He handed the colt's lead to one of the ranch hands and crossed to where she stood. "You're staring," he said, leaning in to kiss her. "I'm appreciating," she corrected. "There's a difference." "Appreciating what?" "Me getting covered in mud and horsehair. Appreciating my life, my husband, my home." Sarah smiled. "Everything." Bear's arms came around her, careful and gentle. He was always careful with her now, as if she might vanish if he held too tight. She'd told him countless times that she wasn't going anywhere, that she was exactly where she wanted to be, but some fears took time to fully release. "I have news," she said softly. "Good news." "Oh." Bear pulled back to look at her face. We're going to need to build a nursery. The cabin I used to live in would work, actually. Close enough to the main house, but separate so the baby doesn't disturb the horses when it cries. She watched his face as understanding dawned. Baby? His voice cracked on the word. Sarah, are you? I am. About 3 months along, the doctor in Cheyenne confirmed it when I went to sign the mine papers last week. Bear's knees actually buckled. Sarah grabbed his arm, laughing and crying at once. Steady there, mountain man. You've faced down grizzlies. Surely one little baby doesn't scare you. Terrifies me, he admitted, his eyes wet. Sarah, what if I can't protect? What if something happens like before? She cupped his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. Bear McKenna, listen to me. What happened to Little Bird and your daughter was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault, and it's not going to happen again. We have doctors, we have resources, and we have each other. This baby is going to be fine. We're going to be fine. You promise? I promise to do everything in my power to make it so. The rest we leave to God and the spirits of the mountains. She smiled through her tears. But yes, I promise. Bear pulled her close again, and she felt him shaking, joy and fear and wonder all mixed together. When he finally spoke, his voice was muffled against her hair. A baby. We're going to have a baby. We are. Due in the fall, right when the aspens turn golden. I don't know how to be a father. Neither of us knows how to be parents. We'll learn together, just like we learned everything else. That evening, they shared the news with Running Elk, who had decided to spend the summer near the ranch. The old trapper laughed with delight and immediately began planning a proper blessing ceremony for when the baby was born. This child will be born into 2 worlds, he said, Anglo and Shoshone, mountain and valley, strong medicine, good fortune. They also wrote to Sarah's cousin Margaret, who responded with a letter full of congratulations and gentle disbelief that Sarah had found such happiness in the wilderness. I confess I didn't understand your choice, Margaret wrote. But seeing how you write about your life there, about Bear and the ranch, I begin to see the wisdom in it. You've found something rare and precious, true partnership, true purpose. I envy you that, cousin. As summer progressed, they made good on their other plans. Sarah began teaching again, but on her own terms, a small school on the ranch property for children from surrounding homesteads. 3 days a week, 6 or 7 children gathered in the converted cabin, learning, reading, and arithmetic and history. The rest of the week, Sarah worked with the horses and managed the ranch's growing business. The mine continued to produce steady income, more than they needed for comfortable living. They used it to help other families struggling in the valley, offering fair prices for goods and extending credit to those who needed it. The same townspeople who'd once gossiped about Sarah's impropriety now sent their children to her school and sought her advice on matters ranging from education to business. Even Mrs. Kemper at the general store had thawed, though she'd never quite apologized for her earlier cruelty. Sarah didn't need her apology. She'd learned that the best revenge was a life well lived, and she was living hers to the fullest. On a warm evening in late summer, Sarah and Bear rode up to the high meadow where he'd given her the wildflower months ago. The same flowers bloomed now in profusion, painting the ground in brilliant colors. They dismounted and walked among the flowers, hand in hand. Sarah's belly was round now, the baby moving actively inside her. Bear kept placing his hand on her stomach, marveling every time he felt a kick. Remember when I knelt at that gate? I remember a woman who was braver than she knew, Bear replied. Strong enough to keep going when she had every reason to give up. I wasn't brave. I was desperate. Sometimes they're the same thing. Bear pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. I remember thinking I should probably turn you away, that having someone around would complicate things, that I was better off alone. What changed your mind? Your eyes. When you looked up at me, I saw someone who understood loss the way I did, who knew what it was like to have everything taken away. He paused, and I saw someone who still had hope, buried deep down. I wanted to protect that hope, give it a chance to grow. You did more than that. You gave me a life, a purpose, a home. Sarah turned in his arms to face him. You gave me you. We gave each other a second chance, Bear corrected, and we'll give our child a first chance at a life built on love and work and the good things that come from choosing courage over fear. They stood there as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. In a few months, their child would be born. In a few years, that child might have brothers and sisters. They would build something that lasted, not just a ranch, but a legacy of love and partnership. Sarah thought of the woman who had knelt at the gate, hollow-eyed and hopeless. She thought of the man who had answered, lonely and locked in grief, and she marveled at how a simple question about horses had changed everything. "Will you take care of my horses?" Bear had asked. She had. And in caring for them, she'd found herself cared for in return. She'd found purpose, dignity, and a place to belong. She'd found love, the second chance kind, that was all the sweeter for being unexpected. The gate still stood at the edge of the property, weathered and sturdy. Every time Sarah passed it, she remembered, not with pain but with gratitude. That gate had been a threshold between desperation and hope, between ending and beginning, and on the other side, a mountain man had been waiting with a simple question that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes mercy looks like a job tending horses. Sometimes salvation comes dressed in flannel and work boots, asking if you'll help with the animals. Sometimes the lowest moment of your life really is the doorway to something you never imagined possible. Sarah had learned that truth, lived it, and would pass it on to her children. That second chances exist for those brave enough to knock on gates and ask for help, and for those generous enough to answer with mercy instead of judgment. Under the vast Wyoming sky, with her husband's arms around her and their child growing within her, Sarah Hartwell McKenna finally understood what home meant. Not a place, though the ranch would always be precious. Not security, though they had that now in abundance. Home was choosing each other, every day, through storms and victories and all the ordinary moments in between. Home was partnership, built slowly and carefully like a barn raised one board at a time. Home was love that saw past surfaces to the wounded hearts beneath and chose to heal together. She had found her home, and she would never let it go.